Hello everybody and welcome to the home of the Conservative Environment Network for the duration of this conference. This is our penultimate event and I'm so happy to see so many of you here this afternoon. So thank you for joining us for this event, which is entitled Will Free Market Environmentalism Help or Hinder Environmental Action? For those that don't know, my name is Kitty Thompson and I lead the Natural Environment Programme here at the Conservative Environment Network. In terms of how the next hour is going to run, I will just give a little brief description of the event and then I will hand over to our panelists for 3 minutes each of introductory remarks, and then the floor will be open for you to questions. So, and it's worth saying I'm looking for questions rather than statements, if that is okay. Thank you. So, we have a new Labour government and they are promising the creation of publicly owned companies to boost clean energy and improve our transport infrastructure, to name just a few things. The Conservatives therefore need to propose a credible alternative to address voters' concerns for the environment, but do so in a conservative or free market way. Could a renewed focus on unleashing the power of the free market help to achieve this, or would this just put environmental progress made under the previous Conservative government in jeopardy? Let's find out. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to our first panellist, which is Dr. Gerard Lyons, who is a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Will free markets be a hindrance or a help? In my view, the answer is a help. The question, though, might suggest it's a choice, but the reality is both the public sector and the private sector can play an important role in addressing the environmental issue in the UK. I'd like to answer or make introductory comments, first in general terms and then some specifics. In general terms, I think the role of markets goes to the heart of the current political debate, never mind to the heart of the current environmental debate. Last week in Liverpool, the Prime Minister talked about taking back control in a way in which it implied that markets were a problem and not a solution to wider economic issues. And in some respects, that goes in general terms to where the debate has been in the environmental space for some time. Markets have been seen as a cause of the problem, and indeed, market failure is often cited as first thing when people pick up an environmental article, book, or whatever. And on top of that, externalities, whether it's in terms of pollution or more recently in terms of water companies pumping sewage into the system, externalities are seen as a consequence of markets not being held to account. But what it really comes down to is the importance of property rights and the importance of having the appropriate regulation and the right incentives in play so that markets can play their role. Let me move on to some specific examples. I look at this issue largely from the perspective of the financial sector. Even though I'm a fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, I also sit on the board of 2 companies in the city, being chair of risk committee in one of them. And the environment has come centre stage in terms of the city and the financial sector. And probably the best example of the markets starting to play a role has been in terms of the way in which there's already been a transformation in the financial sector itself. Now, this wasn't necessarily spontaneous in terms of the financial sector moving itself into that space, but it was a consequence of the core stakeholder groups changing in terms of their behaviours. And those stakeholder groups, indeed one could say it's the wider economy in terms of these stakeholder groups, but from the city's perspective, it's the government, it's not necessarily in the order of importance, government, regulators, peers in terms of your competitors, and ultimately your clients, your customers. And there's been a sea change over the last few decades. So much so that 4 pillars are now really underpinning how firms in the city view the environment. One of those pillars is the metrics and targets to prevent greenwashing, to have more openness and transparency as opposed to previous opaqueness. Second, risk management. And you now have banks and others basically taking into account the environmental consequences and issues when they make risk management decisions. Third, it's reflected in terms of strategy of organisations across the city. And fourth, directly it comes under governance in terms of boards themselves. There are lots of different generic groups and other issues, such as the task force on climate-related financial disclosure is one key aspect, but it's a sea change. One can also see this, just taking maybe another 45 seconds, in terms of how some of these client groups and others, shall we say, are changing. If we take multinational companies, I would say there's already been a sea change from maybe 25, 30 years ago, resistance to climate issues. Then it was partnership. And now companies are seeing it as a competitive advantage themselves to either be investing in or be seen to be a leader in environmental issues. Indeed, one example very recently in the States is quite interesting. 3 Mile Island, which many of you or some of you might remember back in the late 70s when we had a nuclear accident there. What's quite interesting is how now the tech companies who have an insatiable demand for power have actually basically identified nuclear as a potential source of their future energy needs. And as tech companies have started to say that they will invest not just in 3 Mile Island, but in nuclear, that has in turn galvanized the financial sector to see that as a positive sign and to actually provide finance and support. So you're already starting to see a sea change in which private companies, the financial sector, and in turn markets are starting to identify opportunities and address issues. So coming back to the original question, can free markets be a hindrance or a help? It's a help. In general terms, this is not only the heart of the political debate at the moment, but it's been always at the heart of the environmental issue. And we're now, in my mind, already seeing some sectors, finance being one of them, changing, and we're starting to see specific examples come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Maxwell Marlowe. Maxwell is the Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute.
Thank you very much, Kitty. It's a difficult one, right? Fundamentally, when it comes to the question of can free markets be a help or a hindrance, it's not really. I think I'd shift the question. You can't get to net zero without free markets. You can't do environmentalism without free markets. I had the great pleasure of being at Labour Party conference last week, and it was quite astonishing to see most of the fringe events, about 60 to 75%, were about environmentalism, sustainable growth, green finance, you name it. There is a total shift in the discourse now of how Labour is going to execute a lot of its policies and trying to solve a lot of public policy problems using this sort of approach to utilising the private sector to get there. But we must be wary, of course, of basically subsidy hunting and rent seeking. That's very concerning. Something I hope the opposition, even though they are much reduced, will be able to keep an eye on. I was asked in my remarks to kind of look at what free market approaches we should be looking at and should we be taking interventionist approaches. I'm a free market libertarian. Asking me what interventionist approach we should take is like asking a turkey what flavour stuffing it wants to be filled with. I'm very, very careful, but I will come on to that first, Kitty, and I think you'll enjoy the answer. I would ban Drax. Dreadful organisation, tearing down beautiful old ecosystems in North America, shipping them over, and then claiming they can take all the carbon out of the air afterwards. I don't think so. So I'd definitely ban them. And I would, on the other hand, I'd transfer all the subsidy to Rolls-Royce and their brilliant SMRs and AMRs that are currently being bought by the Americans instead of the UK. So that brings me on to what the more free market approach would be, and actually comes down to planning reform. Who here has read Foundations? Not enough people. Everyone, you must read Foundations by Ben Southwood, Sam Hughes and Sam Bowman, two of which formerly of my parish, the ASI. They have identified the issue of the UK's current malaise to be planning, and they highlight a number of areas, specifically getting things built. We last built a reservoir in 1992. We last built a nuclear power station in the 1980s. I will note it was under a Conservative government. And we're currently spending an unbelievably large amount on getting Hinkley Point, the Hinkley nuclear generators up and running. There should really be a new slogan for this government, which should be there should be a chicken on every table and an SMR in every backyard. It is totally possible to do so because there is an incredible amount of private investment out there just floating around, banging at the gates of the UK to let them come in and build these reactors, the reactors we need that produce could be very cheap, depending on how you finance them, very cheap, very abundant, very clean energy. That's all free market. There's also the problems we have of Ofgem. Gerard talked about dumping sewage into water. And a lot of that comes down to how water companies pay for their their infrastructure, their capital costs. It's really hard to get money in to do that because of Ofgem limits dividends, the way in which you get money back for capital if you're a large investor. That limitation is making our water very expensive. It's making it very leaky, and it's making it just not very clean. So we need to unleash the free market there. And I'll finish on this one, to be honest. Because of our planning costs and the costs it take to build a house, for example, it's very hard to then do add-ons such as solar panels, such as batteries for the house. I'll bring up Labour conference again last week. Octopus Energy were there, paired with a house builder. They built an entire house in 2 days outside the conference centre, and it had 0 bills. Now, I've yet to see the evidence on the 0 bills thing because it takes about 10 years for it to come in, but it was mostly a self-generating, for power house. That's all free market. That's all innovation. That's how you solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Go for it, Matthew.
Thank you very much. It's good to be a panel not sponsored by Drax. That's always a rarity. I'm going to speak quickly to what I think the legacy of the previous Conservative government was when it came to market-based environmental policies. And I think we have to start with a bit of honesty here, which is the previous Conservative government, almost as much as this next Labour government, but not quite, did enjoy the idea of banning things, of regulating, of controlling, of not taking a particularly market-driven approach. I think it was Kemi who yesterday described the ban on plastic straws as pointless, as a personal bugbear of mine since every paper straw falls apart. I think this is one of those environmental policies that looks nice, but if you actually assess the amount of plastic which is reduced as a result of the ban, it's minuscule to zero compared to the inconvenience it creates in our lives. I think that's a very important point here when thinking about environmental policies. You want maximum bang for buck, and we saw a lot of bans. We saw bans on plastic straws, on plastic plates, cutlery, cups. Of course, we had the plastic bag ban. We have upcoming bans on petrol and diesel cars and gas boilers. On top of that, we had an environmental bill that liked to set air quality and biodiversity targets, water quality targets. I think the Soviet Union's 5-year plans might have blushed at that particular model of environmental policies, thinking it's going a bit too far. And on top of that, what you created in that process is this extraordinary complex, and you could argue anti-environmental set of judicial review abilities, which has ended up slowing down. The capacity to build the kind of green energy infrastructure we now need is destroyed by all the countervailing environmental policies that make building anything in this country extremely difficult. So we've ended up creating an extraordinary, complex, difficult regulatory state that undermines the environmental goals that we should be trying to achieve here. So I think we need to now step back and think, well, what is the Conservative Party going to do in opposition? How can it be an effective opposition when it comes to the environment? I think there's going to be a temptation here to go quite to the right, in a sense, which is to say reject all the previous environmental legacies of the Conservative Party and just criticise Labour's environmental approach. I think that should be, in a sense, part of the strategy. It is the role of an opposition to find issues with what Labour's doing, particularly when they're picking winners and subsidising particular businesses who might have the most effective lobbyists or spend the most on panels at party conference. And there will absolutely be a role for that. But at the same time, I think if the Conservative Party is going to have a persuasive political narrative, ultimately it's also going to take having an alternative form of environmentalism, not just the same environmentalism that's been done in the past. And I think that is the market-based environmentalism, which has, in my view, 2 ways you can frame it. The first frame is it's about ensuring markets can operate efficiently. It's ensuring getting the regulation out of the way that means that we can't build onshore wind, that we can't build pylons, that we can't build gigafactories, that we can't build the green revolution that we need. On top of that, it's the embracing and acknowledging the fact that the market is efficient. There is no producer that wants to use up more resources than they have to. The incentive for any producer is to minimize input and maximize output. That's one of the best examples of this, is the fact that the aluminium can today probably has 40% less aluminium than it did in the past. Now, in a controlled economy, there's never any incentive because you don't have competitive pressures to reduce the amount of resources you're putting into things. Now, secondarily to that, it's when you can't necessarily depend on direct innovation alone, but you need to put in place prices and property rights in order to ensure that there's better environmental activity. And of course, there was some of that in the previous government, and it proved quite successful in terms of, for example, greening our energy grid. So there is an alternative form of environmentalism that can be both positive and more effective, and you could say more conservative.
Thank you so much. And last but by no means least, we have Luke Graham. Luke is a former MP and a former special advisor to Number 10, as well as being SEN's treasurer. So thank you for being here, Luke.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up. I hope you don't mind. But it's day 3 of the conference in the late afternoon, so we want to get the blood flowing. So from our point of view, taking a bit more of a political side, because planning is a massive issue. I'm sure we'll go into lots of detail during this session. I'm sure there's plenty of frustrated councillors and others in this room who've faced various issues that have been presented to them. But I think the environment is a massive political play for us. For the under 24s, it's pretty much the top issue. For under 35s, it's within the top 5 issues. So from a political point of view, we as Conservatives and the Conservative Unionist Party need to be speaking very clearly about the environment, climate change, and actually champion it as we have done under the last government. And we made some great progress. We've achieved our 3rd carbon budget. We've been one of the leading G7 nations in terms of the progress that we've made. COP26 was an enormous success, although there's been some rollback after that. But in terms of mobilising international finance and actually getting the world focused on new regulation, in more light touch regulation in terms of the ISSB, and also more heavy-handed regulation with the CSRD emerging in Europe. But minds are now focused, and capital has been mobilised, a large part to Conservative and British leadership around the world, which is a fantastic thing. But just to touch on the point about planning and some of the other points that my panellists have made, we can't go on about banning all the time. We are Conservatives. We should be empowering, not banning. And so for me, I think as we look into this next Parliament, we stare across at the masses of Labour MPs in front of us, I think there's 4 kind of key things that we should be focusing on. One is on innovation. So looking at whether it's an evolution of the contracts for difference, whether it's looking at new innovative finance mechanisms and other non-finance mechanisms and infrastructure that can be set up to encourage companies to invest, also to allow some of local government to experiment as well, where they can have more local initiatives that are sustainable and affordable at a local level and that can be passed quickly and deliver more local benefit. We need to also invest in a few moonshots. I want a British Prime Minister to stand up and say, we want fusion by the end of the decade. Because we've been hearing it for the past 40 years, and I want it. Because once we have fusion power, then many of our other problems will fade away. And there's great progress that has been made, but we don't give it not nearly enough time, energy, and money that it needs to be for the priority and the benefit that we could all yield from it. Thirdly, back farmers. If you want to tackle and preserve the environment, we need to back our British farmers. Our young farmers are incredibly innovative in every part of the UK. You can see them diversifying. They're doing everything from carbon capture to new forms of energy generation on the farm to looking at soil regeneration. They are fantastic. They're our allies in this. And so we need to be coming up with new policies and really championing our farmers and our rural communities. Our rural communities are there preserving a lot of the environment that we want to look at, but also benefit from, not just in produce, but obviously in air quality as well. So we need to be backing them. And finally, it's on that point of entrepreneurship. Again, I mentioned about some of the young farmers and the programmes and some of the great schemes that have been going on, again, all across the UK. But in terms of entrepreneurship, we need to be showing people how you can create new businesses. Octopus was mentioned earlier. This is not a legacy company. This is a company that's grown exponentially over the past few years and done phenomenally well. There are a lot of other companies. I was speaking to a micro fusion company. I'm not sponsored by any fusion companies, by the way, but they're looking at new innovative use of fusion on a smaller scale. There's solar panels. There's so many opportunities across environmentalism, and we need to make sure that entrepreneurship is at the front of every Conservative policy. So again, we empower people and not just rely on the heavy hand of the state to slam down on our green areas with new solar panel projects that they will carpet various farmland under Labour. So 4 things for my side, and like I say, a big political play for us now and in the near future too.
Thank you so much, Luke. I'm going to take the opportunity as chair to ask a few questions of the panel, if you will forgive me, audience, but please do get your questions ready too, and I'll come to you next. The first thing that I wanted to draw attention to was that actually at the SEN stand today, we ran a poll which was about trains, and it was basically asking whether competition was good for the train network. And unlike our other polls for the last 2 days, it actually was a 50-50 split. And I wondered, I think that, well, this is the Conservative Party conference. If we can't get a total wipeout answer here, what does this mean for the nation as a whole? And I wondered, as experts in communication of free markets, how do we inspire the public to know that this is the right thing to be doing for the environment and indeed more broadly? Matt, maybe I can do first.
Look, it's worth being honest and saying for the most part we don't have competition on the trains. We have franchise monopolists and a nationalised underlying infrastructure network. Now, the early legacy of the nationalised franchises is not particularly good. They're not more efficient. They're not delivering for consumers. You can contrast that to the relatively few places where we do have open access on the trains, for example, between London and Edinburgh, where you do see when was it Lumo running trains, the time around those times, lower prices across the network. I think the argument here is to say that ultimately the model that the government used for train privatisation didn't enable enough competition, and that you need a different one to enable that. I think it would also be nice to have more kind of competition in terms of building out the train network, which, remember, a lot of the trains were originally built privately. In somewhere like Japan, they have train tracks, train lines, infrastructure, operators all vertically integrated into one company, and then each line is owned by a different operator who compete amongst each other, both as property developers in a sense and as train operators, and it's a different model of competition. So I think it's probably about finding new ways to inject competition into the market when it comes to public transport.
Gerard, would you like to come in on that point as well?
Well, actually, I agree with everything that's just been said. So, actually, when privatisation was proposed, I was a critic of it. Most economists, actually, funny enough, were supportive. But I think Matthew touched on the key point. It wasn't ownership, it was competition was the key issue. And Japan is the best example. Was it 2/3 of it is probably private, 1/3 is public or something like that. But what's the lesson? Lesson is competition, not ownership. Lesson is look for best international practice. And also in terms of Japan, it's about regulations and incentives. And also you're penalised. Japan, everything runs on time. That's partly in their culture. But on the rail system, you're penalised very badly if you don't actually stick to the timetable.
The timetable in Japan is down to the seconds for the train operators.
Yeah, it's using this as an example elsewhere. But too often, and you saw this last week, it was public sector, the state knows the answer. You could push it to the maybe far end of the table here, whether it's always the private sector. It's about getting the balance right, yeah.
And Luke, I wanted to bring you in on this and actually bring up Matthew's point about plastic straws, in that I think, for example, GB Energy that Labour's proposed and the likes of banning plastic straws go down really well with the public. So perhaps with your former MP hat on, how do we communicate not doing things?
I think we just need to come up with better ideas. I think banning comes from bored politicians. It's very easy for us to come up and ban different things, but actually we want to be helping people go on to what's next. So rather than ban things, I think again with market forces, show the benefit of using non-plastic straws, make sure that prices are competitive, show the environmental, and do the campaigns around awareness about the impact of plastic straws. So I think again we need to get to a pull rather than a push or a kind of hammer down, which is where Labour of course will push us.
Can I be naughty and say, who in the room supports the ban on plastic straws? You can disagree with me, it's fine. Who disagrees? Okay, probably slightly on 60-40 there against me. Who likes the idea that whenever you open a bottle cap, it kind of hangs on at the end there? Who think that's a good idea? And who finds that really annoying? Okay, that's an EU environmental regulation that the UK chose to adopt, but doesn't have to actually.
That is our NVIDIA. So that is our NVIDIA. That is the. I think if I may comment on this as well. I think it's fascinating, really. It's an idea that came by a gentleman called Adam Tira, who is now at R Street Institute over in the US. He wrote a book called Permissionless Innovation. And it seems that we are now hurtling toward permissioned innovation, where you have to go to regulators and say, "Okay, if I do this," and we usually know how that goes. No. So unfortunately, I think the bottle caps and the straws, I think, is indicative of a culture within regulators and within politicians to try and control in order to get outcomes. Whereas, as we should all agree, I think on this panel, if you relinquish control from politicians in the states, then I think we get the outcomes we want and more innovation.
We're going. We're going the other way, though. Actually, the environment is a very fascinating example of where there's a danger we might import worst international practice, if that's possible. The IRA policy in the States is about industrial policy. And industrial policy, the number of people I've heard at this conference talk about industrial policy. Industrial policies, even the International Monetary Fund, normally a keen advocate of that interventionist approach, has pointed out earlier this year that industrial policies are now being adopted more and more internationally as a consequence of a very fragmented global economy. And most of them are unsuccessful, expensive, and lead to protectionism. And that's the danger. And the worry in the UK is that the environmental issue might be seen as achievable via industrial policies, which takes us in completely the wrong direction. And that's where the party, the Conservatives, need to push back on, in my view.
Thank you so much for that. One last question from me, and then I promise we will hand over to your questions. Maxwell, you drew attention to Labour's planning policy and indeed foundations, which I do encourage you all to have a read of. Should the Conservatives, or indeed how should the Conservatives support some of this liberalisation? What are the potential pitfalls?
The pitfalls of building houses. I don't think there are any. Let's just, hold on for a moment. The deficit for houses currently is 4.6 million, right? That's quite a lot. You look at square footage, for example, costs in London. They are, almost approaching New York levels. And New York now has rent controls and has done for a long time. It's been very, very bad. And now it has got so bad that there are people on the left of the Labour Party who are pushing for rent controls in the UK, which has been an utter disaster. So, unfortunately, and I'm going to point to the Conservatives here, it has been a betrayal of the British people and the economy to not liberalise planning. What we've done is we have banned planning. I was in Ireland a couple of weeks ago, and I was joking with some friends. I said, you managed to get rid of the British for all that it's worth, and then you inherited their planning system consciously. What are you thinking? Their planning system is as bad as ours. They've got a massive housing crisis as well, and we can hear it from Labour. They're really pushing the planning stuff. I urge Conservative MPs to say you're not going far enough. You have to really own the housing thing and the planning thing. I think it's. I had a chat with Matthew Pennycook, who's the housing minister now. He wants to go further, so you have to make sure the Conservative Party is to the free market right of the Labour Party, or else you're going to lose generations of voters.
Yeah. At the beginning of the year, the Financial Times, in their annual survey of economists, asked, "What's the one thing that you would do to improve the economic outlook?" And the real worry was that most economists who replied had the same answer, and that was planning reform. I actually said planning reform and institutional change. I think there's a need for institutional change across West Whitehall, because we have departments that work in silos, vertical silos up to the minister. We need to have more horizontal planning to address issues, whether it's environmental challenges or AI, etc. But planning reform has been seen by everyone. But when it comes to housing, I would say one has to look at demand, supply, and finance. On demand, you have to have the issue of immigration there up front and accept that plays a huge part in the demand. The ONS, Office for National Statistics, by 2036, we will have expected increase of 7.3 or is it 7.6 million in the population, all driven by migration. So demand is an issue, and this is why these issues need to be addressed together. On the supply, it's not just new build, it's secondary market. We need to have huge turnover. We tax housing in a stupid way in this country. Stamp duty discourages turnover. You need to have a fundamental change there. And then finance. Blended mortgages became a thing at the moment a few years ago. The market was starting to provide a solution. You would still go for your mortgage in the same way, getting it off one provider, but behind the scenes there would be different finance companies prepared to take on the risk. Most UK banks only want to go up to 65, 70% lend. Then you would have pension funds who would want to have take on more risk but want to be paid back over a shorter maturity. And then you'd have some of the hedge funds, etc. UK property market really safe on all the metrics. They would want to take on even more of the risk, 95 to 100% mortgages. but paid back over a short period of time. So behind the scenes, you'd have a blended mortgage. Unfortunately, often when the market starts to evolve, you have the government comes in, decides they're going to actually introduce a new scheme, and it disrupts the market. So it's about demand, supply and finance, and letting the market provide the solutions. Often the government intervenes for the right reasons, only to have a distorting impact as well.
Thank you. Luke, I wanted to bring you on this and to go remind you of my original question is, with your party political hat on, can we support the government of the day as the opposition?
I think you've got to be principled opposition. So if it's going to be something good for the country, we do need to support those things that we generally believe are going to deliver benefit for British citizens. That's a responsible and principled opposition. I think a lot of what they'll put forward won't be, but let's see what they come forward with. But I do think the point about planning and house building, I think the one where we should really challenge Labour as well is on the quality of the housing, the built environments that we're constructing, and actually remind them that, as you just saw with their shift on housing, if you noticed, suddenly they shifted housing away from what is the housing plan that had a lot of Labour seats, and then they shifted onto a lot of Conservative areas, places like North Yorkshire and others, which are now about to have a lot of housing built on greenfield sites, which is not wanted. And actually they haven't got the infrastructure to support those areas either. What we should be looking at, and I think Birmingham's quite a good example of it, is increasing the density of our cities. We are at shockingly low density in our towns and cities all around the UK, and they could be increased. You then have the infrastructure benefits. You could create more economies of scale of these conurbations as well, and it'd be a real benefit for the citizens, rather than keep dumping onto smaller towns and villages that don't have the infrastructure, that have services taken away, and you create even more tensions locally. So I think we need to be tackling on quality and built environment as well as natural environment.
Thank you, Luke. And Matthew, I know the immediate answer will be absolutely, but do you have any thoughts on Labour planning and the environment?
Many thoughts. I mean, everything Luke says right, and it's worth just adding the environmental point here, which is that when you have more dense cities, you have a lower carbon footprint and environmental impact because people don't have to commute as long, they're less likely to get into cars to need to commute. Density is great for the environment. Also, more generally speaking, planning is necessary to achieve the government's the society's broader environmental goals when it comes to green energy. I think there's a point for the Conservatives here, though, which they need to be very careful not to do the, oh yes, we support housing, but, and then listing the reasons why they don't actually support housing. Because I think we've had a lot of that over the last 14 years, and it hasn't been a particularly effective policy. I think there are lots of risks in terms of what Labour's doing that it won't be effective. I think that there's a fundamental risk, which is Labour are still central planners, and there's been enough central planning by definition in the housing market to create enough of a disaster that more central planning might not necessarily fix it, particularly when it's poor central planning like discouraging density, which seems to be some of what they've been doing. On top of that, Labour aren't going to deal with all the other issues regulatory issues that hold back housing development, that slows down projects, particularly with kind of somebody like Keir Starmer, lawyer-in-chief running the country, who genuinely believes judicial review can only ever be a good thing, and giving more power to judges can only ever be a good thing. I think that's going to ultimately be something that really the Tories could get themselves kind of stuck into in the regulatory state. It's going to be messy and complex and might annoy some stakeholders in the process. But if you actually want to get development going, if you actually want to build infrastructure, you really do have to take a kind of much broader look at other regulations that slow down and make applying for anything extremely difficult. Because the reason why you do have these like thousands and thousands of pages of applications for any infrastructure project is just because they're scared they're going to be judicial reviewed. We just put so much legal technicalities in that can slow everything down. And I don't think Labour's got any willingness to fix that. I think the Tories could.
Thank you.
I was going to say, in terms of housing, one of the unintended consequences is lending behaviour by banks. Now, consumer duty is a high priority, and so you should treat customers, particularly your current ones, fairly, etc. But EPCs have now suddenly become central to how the current government is thinking. And banks are going to be incentivised to lend, and therefore not to lend, based on EPC criteria of buildings, if we take things to their natural conclusion. And the UK is a very imbalanced economy in many respects, urban versus rural being one of those imbalances. And when you start to look at EPCs of current built houses and flats, they are low down on the criteria. So it's going to be lots of tensions there in terms of actual what works in theory and what works in practice.
Okay, that's enough questions from me. I will start off with Jack Richardson of Octopus Energy.
Thanks very much. Jack Richardson, Head of Policy at Octopus Energy. I owe you guys a brown envelope with lots of fluffy octopuses. Just saying on the zero bills home stuff, so we're very proud of that. It's 10 years worth of zero bills guaranteed, and at Labour conference we signed a deal with Thagan that all of their new houses are going to be built. We basically use heat pump, rooftop solar and a battery to manage the bills with Kraken, and then you get no energy bills. It's quite fun. They're flying off the shelves. I'm in violent agreement with basically everything this panel has said. Two quick questions. One is, should we have more of a market in our electricity market and more signals to basically bust inefficiency and waste, because that's driving up costs. So I think it's giving renewables a very bad name, to be honest. And two, should we stop taxing the bejesus out of our electricity consumption? We currently tax across gas and electric, but mostly on electric by a factor of like 10 or 12 times. 12 billion a year on electricity and gas consumption by the back door very progressively. Should we stop doing that?
I'll take questions in batches of threes, but I must remind you all, please, statements, not questions. Long are the days of being a Sen chair, Jack. To the gentleman just in front of me.
Thank you very much indeed. My name's Steve Forbes from Basingstoke. It is related to what Jack was talking about, but it also is a case of navel gazing. How do you deal with the fact that the rural group that I went to this morning want to ban onshore wind and ban solar, generally speaking, and yet that, in terms of free marketism, is the cheapest form of electricity? How do we deal with that dichotomy?
Thank you. And then the third question, the lady with the curly hair straight in front of me.
Hi, Rosie from the Woodland Trust. Conversation's been very renewables, net zero heavy. And I take the point of free market, do it as cheaply as possible, as efficiently as possible. But often nature is seen as an extra cost, especially in development, which would also like to clarify the Woodland Trust isn't against well thought out development. Just want to throw that out there. I just want to know how you reconcile nature with free market environmentalism.
So glad for you to raise nature, Rosie. I much appreciate it. Shall we start with Jack's question on electricity and waste and also too much tax, question mark. Max, what would you like to pick?
Too much tax, yes, of course. We at the Adams Institute have a little poem on our website called the Tax Poem, which runs through the mindset of taxes, the tax authorities, and it is tax everything. I'm reminded further of a joke that my boss, Matthew's old boss, Madsen Peary, tells you about, in their will, the person leaves the casket on the front doors of HMRC with a little note on the top saying that now you bastards have everything. It is the case of electricity, as unfortunately as well. Yes, we need to stop taxing taxing electricity consumption, especially as we are getting much more reliant on online stuff. Everything's digital now, and you can definitely see that with businesses. And we did a panel at the Adam Smith Institute looking at nightlife, and when you speak to businesses, pubs especially, what is your biggest concern? It's electricity costs because it's so high. Why are we taxing it? It doesn't make any cities. More people living together in more dense environments is better for the environment, and it's where people want to be, unsurprisingly. So I think we need to scrap the tax on electricity along with other areas too. And in terms of more of a market electricity, absolutely. National Grid, the grid system we've got is fantastic, of course, but it needs a lot more investment. We need to find private ways of investing in that, but I think we can do it. Those are my remarks, I'd say.
Gerard, would you like to come in on the questions on electricity?
Where we are in the UK is that indeed, Luke touched on this in terms of the wider issue, how well we've done in terms of carbon budgets and decarbonisation. But when one looks at it, and Jack mentioned this in the question, our electricity is incredibly expensive because it's heavily taxed. And indeed, across the economy, the UK has the highest cost of energy in the Western world. And it comes down to the issue about when one wants to move from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable driven economy, you need to be mindful of the pace of adjustment. And gradualism is probably better than immediacy. And you need to make sure you do it at a pace at which not only do you take everyone with you in terms of NIMBY groups, but some of the critics of the environmental change talk about you need to be mindful of the technology change that is probably lagging ambition and expectation at the moment. So you need to be pricing things properly so that those people who can invest in this area to provide new sources of electricity or whatever see the opportunity to do so. But yeah, taxation. Unfortunately, tax is not only seen as the way in which you discourage things, it's seen as a clear way in which you fund current spending. And there's lots of gaps here that once you start to take away tax revenue in one area, is going to be people immediately want you to find the revenue in another area. So I think we need to shift the whole debate is the point I'm saying on this.
Thank you. And Luke, you're more than welcome to share your thoughts on electricity, but I would also like to hear your thoughts on Steve's question around rural communities and banning onshore wind and solar.
Yeah, I mean, that's having represented a rural constituency before, it is a very, very tricky issue that comes up because you're looking at a beautiful area like the Ochils and then saying, right, how many wind farms are we going to build on them? But I think that one of the best things is to engage the local community, and hopefully I can answer Jack's question at the same time with this, but if you engage the local community and show what the benefits will be to them in terms of whether that's community funds that come from the new projects or indeed lower electricity costs, I think that is a major score and brings a lot of people, actually mobilises them towards the project. I've sat in a few... cynical about it, though. Absolutely, and I've sat in quite a few community councils and things as well where we've had a discussion. And sometimes I do feel a little bit... I've got limited sympathy for some of these energy companies, but they try and engage the local community, they leaflet everything, and then they only have 5 people turn up, and the 5 people that turn up are those who are adamantly against the project. And so it's quite hard for them as well. But I think that's where we need to look at from a government point of view, and again, from a kind of free market side, is looking at some of the distributed or decentralised grids, where you can have more localised grids, so then you can really show the benefit to those communities of the local power generation, and then whether you adjust that in tax or whether it's just actually in costs, they can really reap the benefits of those, so they can make an informed choice and they have a proper cost-benefit analysis in there. And I'm not allowed to trip ahead to the other question, but just the point about nature from the Woodland Trust, I think, again, this is the geeky accountant in me, but even some of the day-to-day projects that I work on, we're looking at getting natural capital into business cases. So how do you take it into account, both the cost and the benefit of including that natural capital, either additional cost to help the bottom line, basically to get a more rounded kind of business case and show that financial benefit to companies as well, or at least reputational benefit. To quantify that, I think, is a key step forward, and actually would be a kind of market mechanism to really move people forward so they don't just see it as a compliance or additional cost.
Thank you so much. And Matt, I will bring you on any and all.
My favourite way to back farmers, of course, is to back the farmers who want to use their properties to put wind turbines on them, and I think that's well within their rights. I think linking Jack's question quickly to the second question, of course, which I think Jack was hinting at the idea of localised energy markets, so that people do have local wind farms, perhaps their energy should be much cheaper. Maybe that won't persuade everyone against the opposition, but maybe it'll at least dampen it to some extent, and certainly would make for a far more rational national grid system.
Yeah.
On the nature point, I mean, I don't think we should all see a market-based approach as something alien to nature protection. In the first instance, we should note that owners of property have an incentive to protect and safeguard the nature on them, otherwise the value of that property goes down. So often privately owned property is nature protected. Obviously that's not perfectly and always the case, and there are trade-offs involved here. I think though you can create markets in nature protection. In fact, we do have markets in it where if you build on one piece of land, you can fund some nature protection in other bits of land. I think we could have a great trade-off when it comes to the greenbelt. We know a lot of the greenbelt isn't actually green. We know a lot of the greenbelt isn't particularly wild or accessible or a great place. I think you could build on large parts of the greenbelt when it comes to places nearby to stations, and then perhaps use some of the additional surplus that you create by building all that housing in order to do rewilding projects on different parts of the greenbelt. So I think you can create a market in this if you do it in an intelligent way.
I was going to say, on the biodiversity, the great report by Des Gupta a few years ago started to address some of these issues. And I was saying to Kate and Jack before, Bank of China in Beijing signed a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the UK government 3-4 weeks ago on biodiversity. And the chairman of the Bank of China flew over to meet the Chancellor 2 weeks ago specifically on this issue. So the private sector and the UK government are actually apparently putting this very much heart and sort of central in terms of biodiversity and nature.
I love a panel that references the Das Gupta review and encourage you all to read it. More questions, please.
Send bingo.
Councillor Joe Porter. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Kitty. A really good panel. And yeah, Councillor Joe Porter and I sit on the Eastern Advisory Council. Now, obviously, this is a tricky question for those of us who serve in local government, because on one hand, obviously, we want environmental action, we want, sustainable energy projects, but we also want to protect the identity of our local communities. So I'd just like to hear the panel's perspectives on that particular debate, really, because obviously as local councillors, our first job is to represent the best interests of our communities. Obviously, that can sometimes come into conflict with free market environmentalism, if you get what I mean.
Thank you. And other questions? The gentleman straight in front of me with his notepad in the air.
I'm Christopher Pitt. I'm an organic dairy farmer from North Yorkshire. I want some help in somebody steering me past the stupid complexities of the biodiversity net gain rules that came in this spring. I want to put a shed up to treat 1,200 tonnes a year of straw-based manure with the cashew rather than aerobic, and save about 150 tonnes of CO2 per year. The planners agree with it, but I have to complete a very complicated biodiversity net gain calculation, which they sound technically competent to do, which I've done, but it's on a ridiculously complicated government central computer system that nobody can understand. I then went to go and talk to various planning consultants to see how I could do it, and they say all their planning applications at the moment are logjam because of this gross over-complexity of the BNG calculations. Can somebody first of all explain who put it in, and secondly why it overcomes?
I'm not quite sure if anyone can answer specifically, but I'm sure we have lots of thoughts on complexity and from the government. One third question. The man straight in front of me on the fourth or third row.
Hi there, my name is Ethan, I'm from Perthshire, Scotland. Do forgive me, but I do believe I'm the youngest person in the room. But I certainly am not the most knowledgeable on environmental issues, but I'm very, very keen to learn more. And I'm obviously very, very concerned and worried about the Britain's future environmental concerns. And when I speak to my friends and people I know, our young people's sort of consensus regarding this debate that we're having is that we are prioritising economic gain from environmental business rather than environmental concerns itself. We've recently seen the net zero targets being scrapped by the Conservative government, and young people were, from my opinion, were very frustrated by that. So I'm just curious as to whether we really should be focusing as much as we are on profiting from environmental action rather than actually trying to deliver the quickest possible net zero targets and net zero plans. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we start with the local council and protecting the community question from Joe, I wondered. Max, would you like to come in?
Well, I went to school in Newcastle under Lyme, which is just down the road, I think, from you, Joe. So it should be in my interest as well to build lots of houses, please. But I think in coming more seriously to a question about building stuff in the local character, I'm a big fan of using charrettes. You should encourage your developers and property developers to use charrettes, which are essentially local referendums. You can't say no to any of the property. You can't say no to development, but you can pick which designs you like the most. It's much more democratic. Builders like doing it because it essentially gives them an easier design code. So I definitely would recommend that. I think, unfortunately, the way our planning system, our sclerotic, terrible planning system is built, is essentially there to ban development and to ban growth. So I really recommend to Conservative councillors in the room, build it as best as you can, build as many as you can, because future generations will thank you. And I'll keep saying that line again and again and again because it's true.
Luke, would you like to come in on that point, and also perhaps on Ethan's point on reaching net zero quickly versus profitably?
Yeah. Yeah, Joe, I mean, as I mentioned before, I know it's a particularly kind of hotly contested local issue, and you can find yourself, at a sticky end of a lot of issues when it comes to this. I had a very awkward meeting with the chair of the Beaver Council in Perthshire, who said that we were at the sticky end of the Beaver, which was particularly tricky at a breakfast morning meeting. But we basically, when it's coming to this, again, I think it's just on that community engagement, we have to show local benefits from these developments, and there will be a judgment call, because where we've got areas of outstanding beauty, obviously we want to preserve them, but I think it's about getting the balance right. They just can't be everywhere. I know everyone finds beauty in their local area, and the United Kingdom is an incredibly beautiful place, but there are things that can be done to change them. You've seen the new pylon design that I think is used across England in some of the new construction. That's a lot more aesthetically pleasing, some of the steel that's still being used in other parts of the UK. So it's some of the improvements and just showing people that you are engaging, that they can improve, and I think where they get the benefits. And Ethan, to your point, I mean, I think there's a big problem that we've got as Conservatives of the kind of perception versus reality. I think, David Cameron did quite a good job of showing that our heart was kind of in environmentalism. And, it was, if you want to go green, vote blue. And people did believe that for a good period of time. And I think just in what you said there, the kind of, we haven't dropped our net zero targets, we're keeping them. We did push out the conversion for the fossil fuels for cars, so we pushed that to 2035. But actually, we still at the heart, we've driven some of the best performance in environmental measures. We've still been incredibly progressive and quite advanced in G7 nations. But I think you're completely right in the fact that it's the perception of this that often gets lost. And we do allow Liberal Democrats and others to kind of square us into corners, that we're responsible for polluting all the waters and everything was fine, and you could go and drink from the Thames before the Tories came in 2010. So I think again there's a marketing job we need to do, and then make sure that environmentalism is in the DNA of our next round of policies, so that we can show that there's a win-win for anyone economically, in nature, and socially as well.
Thank you. Gerard, would you like to come in? And also on the point around biodiversity net gain, which, although the principle is exciting, perhaps the complexity in reality is not so much.
Yeah, well, on the latter point, I don't think I can add too much apart from a generic point that we have too much regulation. I think the person asking the question himself touched on the answer, namely it needs to be not detoxified, he didn't use that word, but simplified, quite frankly. It's about openness and transparency and removing opaqueness, so you basically see things in a clearer perspective. So, yeah, rules, regulations have gone too far. In terms of, look, the points have all been made, but look, the last question, it used to be 15, 20 years ago, green or growth. I thought the debate had been won that addressing the green agenda was part of the growth agenda. But governments can't do it all by themselves. Nick Stern this summer, Lionel Robbins' lectures at the LSE, he did 3 earlier this year. I would recommend, if you don't want to read the descriptive review, actually listen to those. They're quite good. It's about the importance of addressing the environmental challenge in a growth-focused way. He was very much arguing more through industrial policies as well as the role of the markets. But, right, we've got the part of the challenge on the green side, like take wind. Where are these built? These are built offshore. The mineral cost of extraction for some of the components of wind pylons is really high. There's more level of awareness that we're exporting our problem in terms of having the wind farm here, but building it is not necessarily environmentally friendly, but someone's doing it elsewhere and creating the jobs elsewhere. There needs to be more openness about this so people can scrutinise it. But with maybe President Trump likely to be re-elected in the States, who knows, we could have a challenge to the global order, and we can't rely on rules, regulations in the way in which we did before. So the profit motive becomes central to achieving these things. Companies wanting to invest in environmentally friendly techniques, partly because their customers or future customers want to buy the stuff or the services. So I think one can't see it as an either or. The challenge maybe that you touch on in your question is that ideally we'd like all this done overnight, but you can't do that overnight. It's simple as that. And one needs to be realistic. 2030, I quite frankly think living in cloud cuckoo land, if you have a government policy to have net zero by 2030, you wouldn't even necessarily want it. Just because Drax was mentioned at the beginning by people, and you're hiding behind things to achieve impossible agendas just to tick boxes. You need to be realistic about this, because you do need to grow the economy and you need to keep energy costs down along the way. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but you have to have the profit motive centre stage in some respects. That would be my view. Thank you.
Matt.
Yeah, Joe, so unlike you, I don't have the great honour of being an elected representative, so I don't have to worry about things like protecting the identity of your local community. I would make a philosophical point here, which is you don't necessarily always want the current identity of the local community. We think about what the community was 50, 100 years ago. We don't want the same places. We want progress. We want to achieve things. We want to move society forward. That does mean the identity of the community will change over time, but I think sometimes, more often than not, it's an improvement rather than a backward step. On the point about already being said by other people, biodiversity net gain, one of these regulations that's obviously holding back planning and development quite extensively. It's not something the current government's going to do anything about in a significant way. They've kind of signalled that they would, but I doubt that they will. And the final point there about what we need to do is give up on economic growth and just have environmental goals. I think it kind of ignores the inherent trade-offs. There are costs involved with trying to achieve environmental goals. If you try to achieve them too quickly, you end up making people poorer, and then you end up undermining the environmental goals that you're trying to achieve, and you have a backlash against the environment. You can quite simply show in polling that most people will say in the abstract that they support achieving environmental goals, and then when you start asking them actually how much they're willing to pay per week, per month, it's extremely small amounts. So you've got to be careful that you've got to take people along with you if you want to achieve those environmental goals, not impose costs on them, and not ignore the fact that there can be trade-offs sometimes. That electricity is more expensive than it used to be because, quite frankly, we're not using coal in the same way. That's good. It's good for the environment, but it is costly, particularly in the transition stage, and you've got to do it in a reasonable at a reasonable pace rather than trying to rush it and make us poor, because ultimately we do need to eat, we do need to be able to put on the heating, and people do want to be able to maintain their quality of life.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go to each of the panellists for a final question, and that is, given the title of this panel event, what would be your one message to the future leader of the Conservative Party? And I'll start with Luke.
I think it's got to be innovate, back farmers, engage local communities.
Gerard.
A clear vision and recognise the lesson from the NHS, where people want something for nothing. The reality is in life you either price it properly or you ration it, and therefore the markets have to provide the answer or part of the answer in this question.
Matt.
Don't oppose for the sake of opposing. If there is something that can be helpful and positive and deliver good results, even if it might annoy some people, if there's a longer term benefit there, and it means embracing innovation. If it means embracing entrepreneurship, it means embracing some kind of reform, particularly to planning. Don't just oppose it because it gives you an easy sugar rush.
And Maxwell.
Today we closed down our last coal-fired power station. We also closed down Port Talbot. I want the next Youth Conservative Party to have a vision as to where they want the country to be in the year 2100. Where, what prosperity they think we should have, what prosperity we should deserve, and map out how to get there. We need long-term policy, long-term plans, and for God's sake, build, baby, build.
Thank you so much to everybody in the room for attending. Thank you to each of our panellists. And thank you for everyone that's come to multiple CEN events. This is the last panel event of Party Conference 2024. See you all next year, I guess in Manchester. And for the young Conservatives in the room, we have a networking event beginning at 6 o'clock, and I hope to see many of you there. So thank you.